Today we're going to talk about the English monarchy and its relationship with Parliament, and how the English monarchy differs from some of the absolute monarchs. Today we're going to talk about the English monarchy and how it differs from some of the more absolute monarchies in other parts of Europe, such as Prussia, Austria, Russia, Spain, and France. So a lot of it has to do with this relationship with Parliament as well. So let's dive right in. So one of the English dynasties was the Tudor dynasty, the Tudor line. And their dynasty lasted from about 1485 to 1603. And basically during this time, the way it worked is that the important decisions were made by the king or the queen or their advisors. And then these decisions would pass through Parliament before they were enacted. Now, Parliament was divided into two parts, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords had 60 bishops, dukes, earls, and barons. And to keep their titles, typically they did not criticize the monarch's policies. Now, some of the Tudors had different ruling styles. So Henry VIII regularly held Parliament. He had many conflicts with the Pope, so that was necessary. Remember, he was the king who wanted to break away from the Catholic Church and also from papal supremacy. So he regularly held parliaments to deal with some of those issues. Now, once Mary Tudor became the queen, she actually made it a goal to have a pro-Catholic House of Commons. So Mary was very specific about who she wanted elected. She did not hold parliament often, maybe once every 4 years. And she did make it somewhat clear that the House of Commons had freedom of speech. So that was different from her father. Now here you'll see a Tudor dynasty chart of England. And you'll see started with Henry VII and how it worked itself down. So what you can do is you can look at this later because I have a PowerPoint link version of this. Now, the throne moves to the Stuarts. So let's go back up here. And we'll see that the Stuart line started actually with Henry VII, with his daughter Margaret marrying into that Stuart line, who was James IV, Stuart King of Scotland. So that's where that line is generated. But for the most part, it took a while for them to really get traction and enjoy dynastic rule. So let's look at that. Now, Elizabeth I, who we have covered before, the Tudor monarch, died without an heir. That presented a problem. She had a long and successful reign. The throne passed to her relatives, the Stuarts, who ruled Scotland. And they ruled during a century of revolution and had many conflicts with the Parliament. James I clashed with Parliament over money and foreign policy. And disputes also arose with dissenters of the Church of England, such as the Puritans. So, dissenters are against something. This led to a new translation of the Bible, the King James Version. Now, Charles I carried on a very contentious relationship with Parliament, centered around the right to levy taxes, and the result was the Petition of Rights 1628, which forbade the king from raising taxes without parliamentary consent. This is a big deal during this time, and this did not happen in some of the other more absolute monarchies in Europe. Not at all. So this is kind of placing a limit on how absolute a monarchy could be if it needs to seek permission from the Parliament to raise taxes. So let's look at those early Stuarts. In spite of the petition, Charles I, of course, dissolved Parliament for 11 years, and some of his revenue schemes are a bit questionable. In 1630, well, between 1630 and 1643, people left England as Archbishop Laud enforced strict church rules. 60,000 people left, and 1/3 of them immigrated to the new colony, so they lost a lot of people. Naturally, a rebellion ensued, so people rebelled against taxes. Trouble was brewing in Scotland. And from 1640 to 1653, Charles I was forced to recall Parliament for something called the Long Parliament. And the Parliament was determined to limit the king's power and executed chief ministers to the king, such as Archbishop Laud. So, this next page appears to be a duplicate, but I just want to add a few things that happened during this rebellion. One thing that occurred was that, aside from limiting the king's power and executing some chief ministers, it was also declared that Parliament could not be dissolved without their own consent. So remember how Charles I dissolved Parliament before for 11 years. Well, now Parliament is saying they cannot be dissolved without their own consent. So that also places another limit on the monarchy. Now, Charles I led troops to Parliament to arrest radical leaders such as Oliver Cromwell, and some escaped, but war was imminent. Come on. Sorry, people, I'm trying to get through these slides. Here we go. So, this leads to the English Civil War. And it's basically sometimes characterized as the war between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. So, there were 3 wars in 7 years. That time period is about 1642 to 1649. The wars were really rooted in religious, financial, and political conflict. And as I said, there was the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads. The Cavs were Charles I supporters, and the Roundheads were manufacturers and Puritan clergy. And they were called the Roundheads because they cut their hair close to their heads. So there's a picture right here that depicts that. Oliver Cromwell, a member of the Parliament, led the Roundheads. And by 1647, the Cavaliers were defeated and the king was in the hands of the Parliament. So you can see that the Parliament and the nobility, etc., have more traction or gaining more power or putting some type of limit on the monarchy that did not exist in the other absolute monarchies. So that's the difference that might show up on a quiz. So let's continue with the English Civil War. The king was put on trial and condemned to death in January 1649, and it was the first execution of a monarch in front of his own people. The statement was being made. No king would have limitless power or say. Now this sent a signal that monarchs could not claim absolute power and ignore the rule of law, that they too were subject to law. So that's the difference right there between the English system and what was happening in, say, France. So let's look at the map of divided England during the English Civil War. And you'll see how the districts that were once controlled by the king now start shifting over to Parliament. So this is another map that you might want to study and look at and compare and contrast in the PowerPoint form when you review that. Now, England became a Commonwealth. After Charles I was executed, England became a Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. Remember the Parliament leader who took kind of the rebellion in his hands. Now, the king's death affected many people because a monarchical system is all they really knew, and it created a sense of instability, like what's going on now. The son of Charles I landed in Scotland and declared himself Charles II, and he invaded England. Well, that's kind of a likely response from your heirs. Now, Cromwell and his army eventually took control of both Ireland and Scotland and added that as part of the Commonwealth. But still, there's so much instability and confusion in this time, and there really was a need for stable government. So, in 1653, Cromwell accepted a written constitution called the Instrument of Government, and this created a protectorate consisting of Cromwell and a one-house parliament. Cromwell held things together as Lord Protector for 2 years until his death, so it was a very short leadership reign over this time period, only 2 years. So, now we're going to move from the Restoration to the Glorious Revolution and say hasta la vista to Cromwell. A newly elected parliament invited Charles II, remember this is the son of the executed Charles I, to return to the throne. Charles II was popular, tolerant, and restorative, and those were the traits that were needed at the time. Probably good anyway, right? So, in 1685, James II, who is Charles II's brother, took over and he clashed with Parliament, which is not good. And in response, Parliament invited his daughter and spouse to rule. You might have heard of them, William and Mary. And James I fled to France. Now, this was actually kind of a peaceful transition of power, and that no blood was shed. And that's why it was called the Glorious Revolution. So, just keep that in mind. You know, James II is clashing with the Parliament, and Parliament decided, the heck with you, we're going to bring in your daughter and her spouse. And James I fled to France, without incurring any type of violent opposition. So, that was new. So Parliament becomes a limited monarchy. William and Mary accepted the English Bill of Rights, which states that the king must work with Parliament, and Parliament controls the money. And Parliament had enough power to limit the monarchy. And this is revolutionary for the time. So let's just look at the key points here. Although the Tudor monarchs believed in divine right to rule, they also fostered good relations with Parliament to raise money and gain political support. The Stuarts were absolute monarchs and dissolved Parliament, jailed people without trial, and exacted massive taxes. After signing the Petition of Rights, Charles I dissolved Parliament, but eventually Parliament reconvened and executed the king's ministers. Charles tried to arrest radical Parliament leaders, and this led to the English Civil War and his death. Many people, though, did oppose the Commonwealth because of military rule and strict Puritanism. So, one of the things a little bit overlooked in this slide is that there was quite a heavy religious restriction imposed by Puritans that enacted a lot of changes that the people were not comfortable with. So, let's just close this with the Glorious Revolution and the demonstration that the power of the Parliament was superior to that of the monarchy, which made